In the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians developed some enduring religious ideas and spiritual concepts that deeply influenced today's world of belief, especially through Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On the intellectual level, Sumerian thinkers and sages, through their inquiries into the formation, structure, and functioning of the universe, put forward a powerful and lasting cosmology and theology that would come to dominate much of the ancient Near East. On a practical level, Sumerian priests and sacred officials designed rich, splendid, and emotionally powerful rituals, ceremonies, and rites intended both to please the gods and to fulfill the ceremonial needs of society. On the aesthetic level, Sumerian folk bards, who were often illiterate minstrel poets, and the school poets and scribes who gradually replaced them, created the most comprehensive corpus of mythological narratives in the Near East. These narratives reduced the gods to human dimensions, yet this reduction was done with reverence, grace, and originality. The scientific data available to Sumerian philosophers and thinkers about the universe was quite limited. Therefore, they tried to understand the structure, content, and operation of the universe based on fundamental and observable phenomena. According to them, the main components of the universe were the sky and the earth. In fact, the word they used for universe was the compound Enki, meaning sky-earth. The world was imagined as a flat disk with a great void above it. This void was covered by a dome-shaped solid surface. The exact nature of this celestial material is unknown. However, the Sumerian word for tin, meaning celestial metal, suggests that this material might have been tin. It was assumed that a substance called Lil existed between the sky and the earth. This word roughly means wind, breath, spirit, or air. The most distinctive feature of this substance was its motion and diffusion. In this respect, it corresponds to our modern concept of atmosphere. The sun, moon, stars, and planets were also made of this atmospheric substance, but they were also endowed with brightness and light. The sky-earth was surrounded both above and below by an infinite body of water, and this structure stood fixed within this sea. Based on these fundamental assumptions about the structure of the universe, Sumerian thinkers constructed a coherent cosmogony. According to this view, at the beginning of everything, there was a primordial sea. This sea was the first cause and first driving force of the universe. What came before this sea in terms of time or space appears never to have been questioned. From this sea emerged the sky-earth universe, consisting of a flat earth and a domed sky placed on top of it. Between these two layers was a moving, expanding, and living atmosphere. From the atmosphere, the luminous celestial bodies, the sun, moon, stars, and planets, were brought forth. After the separation of sky and earth and the creation of celestial beings, plants, animals, and finally humans appeared. According to Sumerian theologians, this universe was governed directly by the gods. These gods were human in form, but they were immortal, superhuman beings. These gods, invisible to the human eye, ruled the universe according to regular laws and prepared plans. Every element of nature and every cultural entity was under the authority of a god. The sky, the earth, the sea, and the air. Celestial bodies like the sun and moon, natural forces like storms and hurricanes, rivers, mountains, and plains, cities, state structures, ditches, fields, and farms, even tools like the pickaxe, plow, and brick mold were associated with a divine being. All these elements took their place within a pantheon system, and the functioning of the universe was distributed among the gods. Behind the ideas that Sumerian theologians developed about anthropomorphic gods, there was likely a logical inference, even if not explicitly stated. According to this reasoning, it was not possible for them to have directly observed these beings. Probably, the theologians conceptualized divine beings based on the human society since humans ruled cities, palaces, temples, fields, and farms, and since these would fall into ruin if left ownerless, it was likely thought that the universe must also be organized in this way. Since the cosmos was much greater and more complex than human systems, the beings who ruled it had to be far more powerful and enduring than ordinary humans. Immortality, therefore, was a fundamental condition. Otherwise, the death of these beings would lead to the collapse of the cosmos and the end of world order. These anthropomorphic, yet superhuman and immortal beings were called Dingir by the Sumerians. Today, we usually translate this word as God. The functioning of the Sumerian pantheon exhibited a hierarchical structure, much like that of a state organization. It was openly acknowledged that not all gods were equal. For example, a god responsible for the plow or the brick mold could not be considered on the same level as a god who governed the sun. With this understanding, the existence of a supreme god recognized as king by the other gods was assumed. Thus, the pantheon was imagined as a divine assembly led by a king. Within this structure, special groups of gods were formed, such as the 7 gods who determine fates, and around 50 great gods. However, a more significant distinction was made between creator gods and non-creator gods. According to the cosmological understanding, the primary components of the universe, sky, earth, sea, and air, were the essential elements of being. The gods who ruled these 4 elements were considered creators, while the rest of the gods were thought to represent elements derived from these fundamental existences. In Sumerian thought, the act of creation occurred through the power of the god's word. According to this belief, all a god had to do was make a plan, name it, and speak it into existence. The divine word was a creative force. This belief appeared to be inspired by the observation of human society. If a king could accomplish something simply by giving a command, the gods could certainly do even more. Perhaps this belief also arose from people's hope during difficult times that their desires might be fulfilled merely through wishes. The concept that ensured the continuous and stable operation of the universe and cultural order was me. This concept represented the set of rules determined by the creator god for each entity or institution to function properly. This system was a solution that, although it obscured some difficulties in cosmological explanations and could not be fully defined, was effective in practice. The most comprehensive source regarding me is the mythological poem Inana and Enki. The transfer of the arts of civilization from Eridu to Erech. As understood from Sumerian myths, the gods were entirely anthropomorphic. Even the most powerful god was portrayed as resembling humans in thought, emotion, and behavior. Gods made plans, ate and drank, married, had children, fought, got injured, and sometimes even died. Although they were believed to be immortal, many narratives describe them as falling ill, going to war, and suffering harm. Sumerian thinkers did not attempt to systematically explain this contradictory nature of the gods, and it appears such questions did not even occur to them. For example, they did not show much concern for questions like how statues of gods made from stone, wood, or metal could be regarded as living, breathing beings. These contradictions in the Sumerian belief system did not push the limits of their thinking, because many issues did not pose a problem for them. Details like what the gods ate, how they reached sacred places, or how they fulfilled their celestial duties were secondary matters. For this reason, Sumerian theologians preferred to make their beliefs functional and practical rather than resolving contradictions within a theological system. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, the existence of a vast pantheon consisting of hundreds of gods was at least known by name among the Sumerians. The names of most of these deities are known not only from god lists prepared in school texts, but also from sacrificial lists inscribed on tablets uncovered in excavations, and from personal names like Shepherd of X, X had a great heart, Servant of X, Man of X, One like X, or X gave me, where X refers to a deity. The majority of these numerous members of the pantheon were of secondary status. They were spouses, children, or servants assigned to higher status gods based on human relationships. Some may also have been alternative names or titles of well-known major deities. Nevertheless, the names of many gods were mentioned regularly throughout the year in worship rituals, offerings, and prayers. Among this large group of deities, 4 were the most important: the sky god An, the air god Enlil, the water god Enki, and the mother goddess Ninurta. And these 4 typically appeared at the beginning of god lists and were presented in mythological narratives as a group performing important tasks together. They were seated at the head of the divine banquets and assemblies of the gods. There are many indications that the sky god An was once regarded as the supreme god of the pantheon. However, beginning around 2500 BC, written records show that leadership passed to Enlil. An's capital, Erech, was a significant political center in Sumerian history, and in this city, hundreds of tablets containing early semi-official writings dated shortly after the invention of writing were unearthed in the 20th century by a German archaeological team. Although An continued to be worshipped for millennia, over time he lost his former power, and his name was mentioned less frequently in mythological texts, while Enlil gradually assumed much of An's former authority and functions. Within Sumerian religious traditions, the most dominant and central figure was undoubtedly the air god Enlil. Throughout the land of Sumer, ceremonies were held in his name, and he played an active role in prayers and myths. Although it is not precisely known how Enlil rose to become the leading god, in the oldest documents he is described as Father of the Gods, King of Heaven and Earth, and Lord of all the lands. Kings stated that they owed their rule and success to Enlil, and proudly declared that their royal scepter and title were given by Enlil. From religious poems and narratives of a later period, it is understood that Enlil was regarded as the source of fertility, life, and production. He was the god who caused the sun to rise, dropped seeds into the earth, showed compassion to humans, and shaped the first prototypes of agricultural tools. The positive qualities he contributed to nature and human life contradict the widespread but mistaken view that Enlil was a cruel storm god. This misconception is largely based on the abundance of laments among early Sumerian texts that describe disasters. In these laments, Enlil appears as the god responsible for carrying out destructive decisions made by the gods. However, in light of hymns and myths published later, it is clearly understood that Enlil was idealized as a just and compassionate god who cared for the prosperity of the Sumerian people. The deep respect and devotion shown to Enlil were especially concentrated in the city of Nippur, where his sacred temple, Ekur, was located. In a recently deciphered hymn, Enlil's power and greatness are praised as follows: Enlil, whose commands reach far and who determines destinies with his sacred words, the Lord who surveys the land with a glance and sheds light into hearts, sits on his white throne with boundless authority. Before him, the gods of heaven and earth bow in reverence. He is just like a net that traps the wicked and the corrupt. he forgives not the sinner, overlooks not the oppressor. His temple, Ekur, established on the great mountain in Nippur, overflows with abundance. The sacred structure of Ekur reaches into the sky. Its shadow spreads across the lands. Its temple is built of lapis lazuli stones, a glorious seat of residence. All lords and rulers bring their offerings here and present their prayers within. He who is honored by Enlil's gaze is exalted in the land. The ground upon which he steps brings enemies to their knees. The hymn emphasizes the functions, fertility, and role of Enlil's holy house, Ekur, within the cosmic order. Enlil, who conveys his commands only through his vizier Nusku, is the sole source of divine order. No city could be founded, no king could rise without his permission. Neither could rivers overflow, nor clouds bring rain. The fruitfulness of mountain forests, the sprouting of grains, and the proliferation of living beings on earth were all possible only with Enlil's decree. Without Enlil's dominion, no homes, barns, or temples could be established. No social structure could take form. Without his command, no priest or king could be chosen. The continuation of order on earth was synonymous with his name. One of the leading gods of the Sumerian pantheon, Enki, was the god who governed the primeval waters of the universe, known by the Sumerians as the Abzu. Enki, also the god of wisdom, had undertaken the task of organizing the earth. This organization was carried out within the framework drawn by Enlil, who issued the divine decisions. While Enlil did the planning, it was the skillful, intelligent, and brave Enki who implemented the details of that plan. The myth titled The Ordering of the Earth and Cultural Processes provides considerable information about Enki. In this narrative, Enki's foundational role in the creation of natural and cultural phenomena is highlighted. The myth serves as a vivid example of the Sumerians' general approach to nature and the workings of the universe. Throughout the myth, the deeper reasons behind natural events or cultural institutions are not explored. Instead, they are simply stated as Enki did it. If there is any technical explanation of the creation process, it appears solely in the form of the god's word or command. Another important deity following Enki is the goddess Ninhursag, also known by the title Great Lady, or alternatively Ninma. In earlier periods, her position was likely even higher. In some texts, she is mentioned before Enki. It is believed that her original name was Ki, meaning earth, and she was considered the consort of the sky god An. In this context, An and Ki might be regarded as the parents of all the gods. Ninhursag is also known by the name Nintu, meaning birthing woman. Early Sumerian kings loved to describe themselves as those nourished with milk by Ninhursag. Regarded as the mother of all living beings, this mother goddess plays significant roles in narratives of human creation. In another myth set in the heavenly land of the gods, Dilmun, she initiates a chain of births in a story reminiscent of the forbidden fruit motif. In addition to these four great deities, there are three other major figures among the Sumerian sky gods: the moon god Nana, his son, the sun god Utu, and his daughter, the goddess of love and war, Inana. The group known as the Seven Who Decree Destinies probably consists of An, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, Nana-Sin, Utu, and Inanna. Although the names of the 50 great gods are not explicitly given in the texts, it is believed that these deities were likely identified with the Anunnaki gods, who were children of An, especially those not confined to the underworld. There is also another group of gods called the Igigi. However, since they are rarely mentioned in written sources, they appear to have taken on smaller and less important roles. Turning from gods to humans, we see that there was little confidence in humanity within Sumerian thought. The Sumerians believed that humans were created from clay for one sole purpose: to provide food, drink, and shelter to the gods, and to make their work easier. Human life was full of uncertainties, as the motives behind divine actions could not be predicted. When a person died, their weakened spirit would go to a dark and troubled underworld, a gloomy and impoverished reflection of earthly life. In Sumerian thought, the issue of free will, a fundamental theme in Western philosophy and often seen as complex and unsettling, found virtually no place. The Sumerians firmly believed that humans were created solely to serve the interests and whims of the gods. Just as they accepted that death belonged to humans and immortality only to the gods, they also unquestioningly embraced their dependent status. The honor for all high moral values and ethical understandings developed by the Sumerians over centuries of great hardship was attributed entirely to the gods. It was the gods who established this moral order, and humans' duty was simply to fulfill this divine order. When examining their own written sources, it becomes clear that the Sumerians highly valued truth and goodness, laws and order, justice and freedom, honesty and compassion, and they detested evil, lies, disorder, injustice, oppression, sinfulness, and cruelty. Especially kings and rulers boasted about establishing law and order in the land, protecting the weak from the strong, the poor from the rich, and eliminating evil and violence. For example, Uruk proudly declared that he had brought justice and freedom to the long-oppressed people of Lagash, removed greedy officials who caused injustice and exploitation, and protected widows and orphans. About 4 centuries later, the founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur-Nammu, listed similar ethical accomplishments in the prologue to his law. He had eliminated bureaucratic corruption, regulated measurement systems to ensure honesty in markets, and protected the most vulnerable members of society from abuse. Again, about 2 centuries later, Lipit Ishtar of Isin, while introducing his new law, stated that he had been specially chosen by An and Enlil to provide justice, address public grievances, and suppress enemies. Many hymns written for Sumerian kings are similarly filled with expressions that emphasize high moral virtues. According to the thought of Sumerian sages, the gods themselves preferred what was ethical over what was unethical. Almost all the major gods in the Sumerian pantheon are praised in hymns dedicated to them as deities devoted to goodness, truth, justice, and honesty. Among the gods who played an active role in maintaining the moral order, the sun god Utu stands out in particular. Another example is the goddess Nanshe of Lagash. Her moral function is described in a hymn dedicated to her as follows: "She who knows the orphan, who recognizes the widow, who sees the oppression people inflict on each other. Mother of orphans, Nanshe, who cares for widowed women, who brings justice to the poorest, queen who opens her arms to those who seek refuge, who provides shelter to the powerless." In another part of the same hymn, it is told that Nanch judges people on New Year's Day. During this judgment, the goddess of writing and accounting Eduba, her consort Haya, and other witnesses are also present. The individuals who incur the wrath of the goddess are listed as follows: those who have strayed into sin and exceeded boundaries, those who violate rules and break agreements, those who protect and value evil places, those who cheat in measurements, those who consume what belongs to others and deny it, those who boast of eating and drinking what is forbidden. Nansha's sense of justice becomes even more apparent in these verses: to console the orphan, not to leave anyone widowed, to establish a place where the mighty shall fall, to rescue the powerless from the hands of the powerful. Nanch tests the hearts of people. However, despite the moral aspects of all these gods being exalted, according to Sumerian thought, negative elements such as evil, lies, oppression, and violence were also designed by the gods during the process of building civilization. Among the divine laws that ensured the cosmic order, called the Mi, not only virtues such as justice, peace, and goodness were included, but also elements like lying, conflict, lamentation, and fear. This raises the question, why would evil and suffering be planned by the gods as well? When looking at Sumerian sources, the answer to this question is unclear. The sages seem to acknowledge that it is not always possible to understand the intentions of the gods. The stance of a Sumerian equivalent of Job is not to question or rebel in the face of seemingly unjust calamities, but rather to pray, weep, confess sins, and show remorse. But no matter how sincerely he prays and breaks his pride by falling to the ground, would the cries of this lonely and powerless mortal attract the gods' attention? Sumerian teachers would likely answer no to this question. According to them, the gods were just like earthly kings, occupied with far more important matters. For this reason, just as one needs intermediaries to reach a monarch, one also needs an intermediary to communicate with the gods. This belief led Sumerian sages to develop the concept of a personal god. This god, present beside each individual or head of a household, was their divine protector, essentially a spiritual father. The suffering person would pour their heart out to this personal god, finding comfort and hoping for salvation through them. All of this is learned from a poetic text whose fragments were recently pieced together. This text addresses the theme of suffering and submission, most famously explored in the Book of Job among sacred scriptures. Although its scope, depth, and literary power cannot be compared to the Book of Job, the importance of this Sumerian poem lies in it being the earliest written response to this ancient yet still relevant human problem. It predates the Book of Job by more than 1,000 years. At the center of the poem is the idea that, no matter how unjust the suffering and calamities may appear, the only correct path to follow is to continuously glorify the god and to keep praying to him with tears. This god is the individual's personal god. Within the Sumerian belief system, he plays the role of representative and intermediary among the community of gods. The poet bases this idea not on philosophical debates, but on a concrete example. An unnamed man is mentioned. This man is rich, wise, and honest. He has friends and relatives around him. But one day, he is struck by sudden illness and disaster. He has committed no offense against the gods. On the contrary, he has poured his heart out in prayer and tears. Eventually, his personal god shows mercy. He hears his prayers, rescues him from his bad fate, and turns his suffering into joy. Structurally, the poem can be divided into 4 parts. The first part is a short section of advice and consists of 5 lines. A person must always proclaim the greatness of their God. A young person should humbly glorify the words of their God. He who lives in a righteous land must groan. In the house of song, he should comfort his friends and companions. He must soothe his heart. After this, the poem recounts the misfortunes, prayers, and pleas of this unnamed man. The main section of the poem describes the injustices he suffered at the hands of his friends and enemies. Then comes his lament over his own situation. In this section, he confesses his faults and directly calls upon his God for help. I am understanding, yet no one values me. My true words have turned into lies. The deceitful dragged me away. I became their slave. Those who have no respect have humiliated me before you. You gave me new sorrows again and again. My soul is heavy when I enter the house. My heart is troubled when I go out into the streets. My God, who should protect me, looked upon me with hostility. A shepherd who was not my enemy did evil to me. My friends denied my truthful words. I fell into traps. And you, my God, did not stop it. In this section, he also says, I, the wise one, why am I surrounded by the ignorant? Everywhere is filled with food, yet I am in hunger. When the day of distribution comes, all I receive is sorrow. My God, I will speak with you. I will complain about the hardship of my path. Let my mother not cease her lament. Let my sister not sing. Let them recount my misfortune. Let the singers give voice to my laments. My God, the world is bright, but for me it is dark. The days are beautiful, but I only cry. Bad fate has seized me. Illness has enveloped my body. Finally, the happy ending in the poem is described as follows. The man's tears and pleas reached his God. The prayers of the young man softened the God's heart. His virtuous words were accepted. The God saved him from his bad fate, drove away his widespread illness, broke his dark destiny, turned his sufferings into joy, placed protective spirits by his side, granted him angels with beautiful faces, and the man continued to glorify his God. However, whether it be a personal God or a guardian angel, according to Sumerian thinkers, a person would inevitably die and go to the land of the dead, never to return. This was naturally a source of great anxiety and unease. The topic of death and the afterlife was full of contradictions, and Sumerian thoughts on this subject appeared neither consistent nor certain. For example, the royal tombs unearthed by Sir Leonard Woolley through meticulous excavations in Ur were of great importance to Sumerian culture. These tombs clearly revealed that not only were kings buried with their valuable possessions, but also accompanied by a retinue of people. Following this surprising discovery, cuneiform specialists, especially Sumerologists, began searching for written documents that would support this practice. But they were unsuccessful. Yet in the past 20 years, many Sumerian myths, hymns, laments, and historical texts have come to light. It was hoped that some of these documents would provide information about the royal tombs and Sumerian burial traditions. However, this hope did not yield the expected result either. The fact that the royal tombs date to around 2500 BC, while most written documents date to around 2000 BC, is sufficient to explain this situation. Today, the only written document that archaeologically confirms the presence of servants buried with ancient kings is a small tablet. This tablet, housed in the University Museum of the University of Pennsylvania, contains 42 lines from the heroic story of Gilgamesh. Most likely, this text belongs to the narrative tentatively titled The Death of Gilgamesh, which currently exists only in fragments. In this poetic account, it is said that Gilgamesh offered gifts and sacrifices to the gods of the underworld and the important spirits there, especially to his wife, son, concubine, musician, entertainer, chief chamberlain, and house staff who were buried with him in his purified palace in Erech. It would not be unreasonable to assume that the poet depicts these offerings as presented after the death of Gilgamesh and his retinue, following their descent into the underworld. If this interpretation is correct, then we are indeed dealing with a written source that supports the royal tombs containing numerous individuals unearthed by Woolley. Furthermore, as we know from the Tumul inscription, Gilgamesh was a contemporary of Mesanapada, aligning with the period represented by the royal tombs. Another document that provides extensive information about post-mortem funeral practices of kings is the 6-column Ur-Nammu text, also found in the same museum and belonging to a literary category not yet definitively classified. The first column of this tablet is completely damaged, but it may contain a poetic account of Ur-Nammu's successes in war and peace, followed by his unfortunate death. The sections beginning with the second column describe how Ur-Nammu, abandoned on the battlefield like a broken pot, is laid on a funeral bier in the palace and mourned by his family and people. Then, just like Gilgamesh, Ur-Nammu descends to the underworld and offers sacrifices to the 7 gods. He also sacrifices bulls and sheep to important deceased individuals. To gods such as Nergal, Gilgamesh, Ereshkigal, Dumuzi, Namtar, Hubishag, and Ningish-Zida, he offers weapons, vessels, garments, jewelry, and other symbols. He also gives offerings to Dimpimikug and the Scribe of the Dead. The poet does not clearly explain how Ur-Nammu reached the underworld with all these gifts and offerings. Only the chariots mentioned in earlier lines might have been used for this passage. Eventually, a place is allocated to Ur-Nammu, possibly by the priests of the underworld. There, some of the dead are assigned to serve him, and his beloved brother Gilgamesh explains the laws and operations of the underworld to him. However, after 7 days, 10 days pass, and the Laments of Sumer reach Ur-Nammu. The unfinished walls of Ur, the palace whose name he cannot mention, the wife he will never embrace again, the son he will never again bounce on his knee. All of these fill his eyes with tears, and a long lament begins. The main theme of the lament is that despite having served the gods faithfully, he received no help in his time of need. He is now dead. His wife, friends, and people are in mourning. Since the final column is completely lost, the ending of the poem is unknown. However, the content we have makes it difficult to definitively place this text into a genre. In some respects, it can be seen as a historical poem resembling The Curse of Agada, which describes the sorrowful process following Ur-Nammu's death. Regardless, this document offers significant details about life in the underworld from the perspective of Sumerian sages. In this realm, both gods and important deceased individuals must be appeased. The newly arrived dead are placed in a special area, and especially if he is a king, the laws of this realm are taught to him. Even though he is dead, this person can maintain an emotional bond with the world above. He can suffer, feel shame, and rebel against untrustworthy gods. However, unlike the death of Gilgamesh, there is no mention of a human retinue serving the king here. Family members, his wife and children, are portrayed as if they still live in the world above. For this reason, it can be assumed that by the time of Ur-Nammu, the tradition of burying servants or family members with the king had come to an end. As for ordinary mortals, 2 laments inscribed on a tablet housed in the Pushkin Museum reveal many previously unknown details about the Sumerian view of the underworld. From this tablet, we learn that Sumerian thinkers believed the sun passed into the underworld after sunset, turned night into day there, and that the moon spent the final day of each month, the day of rest, in the underworld. It is also for the first time in this tablet that we encounter the belief that the dead are judged by the sun god Utu, and that their fate is determined by the moon god Nana. According to the tablet, in the underworld, there are heroes who eat bread and drinkers who quench their thirst with sweet water. It is possible to pray to the gods on behalf of the dead. One may plead in the name of the deceased's personal god and city god. Additionally, the well-being of the deceased's family is always mentioned in funeral prayers. The source that provides the most comprehensive information about the underworld and the life carried on there is the poem titled Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld. This text symbolically defines the underworld as the Great Dwelling. In the city of Erech, there is said to be a kind of gate that opens to this realm. From it, wooden objects like puhu and mihu can fall down, and the gate can be touched by hand or foot. According to this poem, a mortal, if heroic like Enkidu, can descend through this gate, but how this descent occurs is not clearly described. However, the poem states that anyone wishing to descend into the underworld must follow certain sacred prohibitions. They must not wear clean clothes, not anoint themselves with fine oils, not carry a weapon or staff, not wear sandals, not make noise, and must not behave ordinarily toward their family. If any of these taboos are broken, the person will be surrounded by guards and shadows dwelling below, and will be caught by the whale of the underworld. Once a mortal is seized by this whale, they cannot return to the surface unless one of the gods intercedes on their behalf. In Enkidu's case, it is the god Enki who intervenes. He commands Utu to open the gates of the underworld, and Enkidu apparently returns to the earth not as a ghost, but as a living man. In the continuation of the poem, there is a poignant dialogue between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, in which Enkidu describes the conditions of the dead and of certain selected groups in the underworld. Setting aside ordinary or extraordinary mortals and turning back to the immortal gods, the underworld appears to be the last place such beings would inhabit. Yet, we encounter many gods in this realm. Some appear to be natural residents of the underworld, while others, originally sky gods, seem to have been condemned to this realm through theological speculations and developments within Sumerian mythology. Although most of the myths on this subject have not survived to the present, those that have are almost entirely about the passionate goddess Inana and her unfortunate consort Dumuzi. The only exception is the myth titled Enlil and Ninlil, the birth of the moon god. This tale recounts the banishment of Enlil, the most powerful figure of the Sumerian pantheon, to the underworld, and his wife Ninlil's descent into that realm in pursuit. Additionally, this myth is the only source we have regarding the Sumerian belief in the man-swallowing river that the dead must cross, and the boatman who carries them to their destination, an idea that was also very common in ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean cultures. Another highly detailed myth regarding death and the underworld is the narrative titled Inanna's Descent to the Underworld, and this text has survived almost completely intact. According to this poem, the underworld, although its exact location is not clearly specified, is likely a place that can be entered and exited through a gate located in Erech. Within the realm of the dead, there is a place called the Mountain of Lapis Lazuli. This is a space guarded with locked and bolted doors under the supervision of the gatekeeper, Neti. This underworld is governed by certain divine laws. The most striking of these rules is that everyone who descends there, including gods, must become naked. Another rule, which leads to Dumuzi's tragic fate, is this: once a being steps into the underworld, whether mortal or divine, they cannot return to the upper world unless a substitute is found. Indeed, although Inanna is brought back to life with the help of Enki, the 7 gala attendants do not leave her side until Dumuzi is sacrificed in her place. When all this information is considered, it appears that the Sumerian beliefs about death and the afterlife are generally vague and contradictory. According to the widespread belief, the underworld lies beneath the earth and represents a vast cosmic void corresponding to the heavens. The souls of the dead typically reach this place through the grave. However, it was also believed that there were special gates opening into this realm in Erech and possibly in other major cities. To cross into this world, the dead had to pass over a river by boat, but the exact location of this river is not specified in the myths. The underworld is ruled by Ereshkigal and Nergal, and alongside them are 7 Anunnaki gods, some exiled sky gods, and a group of attendants called Gala. All the gods, except for the Gala, require food, clothing, weapons, utensils, ornaments, and similar items, just like sky gods or humans. Ereshkigal has a palace with 7 gates, but the location of this palace is not specified. It is understood that even the dead exist within a hierarchy, just like the living. At the highest level are deceased kings or high priests like Gilgamesh or Ur-Nammu, who are commemorated with special sacrifices. Even in this underworld, there are rules, regulations, and divine supervision. The main figure maintaining this order is the deified Gilgamesh. Although the underworld may appear dark and gloomy to humans, this condition applies only during the day. For at night, the sun brings light to this realm, and the moon joins it on the 20th. However, there is no equality among the dead. The sun god Utu, and, to a lesser extent, the moon god Nana judge the dead. If the judgment yields a favorable result, the soul of the deceased lives a peaceful and contented life and fulfills its desires. Nevertheless, it is evident that the Sumerians did not place great confidence in the expectation of a good life in the afterlife. Generally, the afterlife was believed to be a sorrowful and impoverished reflection of life on earth. Personal belief and individual devotion are not insignificant, but Sumerian religion is fundamentally based on rituals. For humans were created to serve the gods, and their highest duty was to fulfill this service in a manner that pleased the gods. Ziusudra's survival of the flood was due to his humble and faithful daily worship of the gods. Sumerian kings also never hesitated to emphasize that they performed their religious duties in accordance with prescribed order and rules. The focus of the cultural and religious life of Sumerian cities was undoubtedly the temple. One of the earliest temples was discovered in the city of Eridu, whose patron deity, at least in later periods, was Enki. This early sacred structure, measuring only 4 by 5 meters, had a very simple design but already contained the 2 fundamental elements that Sumerian temples would retain for millennia: a niche for the statue or symbol of the god, and in front of it, a mud brick altar. Over time, this structure was renovated, expanded, and transformed into a more developed temple. In this new arrangement, a central room for sacred relics was surrounded by secondary rooms. In front of the altar, there was an offering table placed so that it faced one of the shorter walls of the temple. The simple mud brick walls of the temple were visually enlivened with alternating indentations and projections. The entire structure was built on a platform accessed by a set of steps. The entrance was located on the long side of the building. Just north of Eridu, another temple, probably dedicated to the sky god An, was found in the city of Erech. This structure is dated to around 3000 BC. While its overall layout resembled that of the temple in Eridu, the difference here was that it was built not on a platform, but on an artificial mound, rising approximately 10 meters above the plain. A staircase on the northeast side of the temple led to the whitewashed sacred chamber at the top. Similar architectural features were observed in another temple uncovered at Uqair. Although the platform on which this structure was built was only 5 meters high, the temple itself was constructed as a 2-story building. This structure is considered one of the earliest examples of ziggurats, which aimed both physically and symbolically to connect the gods in the sky with humans on earth. The Uqair temple also stands out for another innovation that did not become widespread in Sumerian architecture. The interior walls were decorated with frescoes, colored paint embellishments. These frescoes generally followed this sequence: a solid red band about 1 meter high around the bottom of the walls. Above that, a second strip of 30 centimeters with geometric patterns, and the upper parts of the walls adorned with human and animal figures painted on a white background. Another architectural innovation was tried in the Inana temple built in Erech. The temple's simple mud brick walls and columns were covered with tens of thousands of small clay cones painted in different colors by dipping them in colored clay paste. These cones were embedded in thick layers of mud plaster to form multicolored triangles, lozenges, zigzags, and various geometric patterns. Throughout the 3rd millennium BC, Sumerian temples evolved while maintaining the same basic plan. Their dimensions increased, and they became more complex structures. Forecourts became standard, and temple layouts could take on oval forms in addition to rectangular ones. During this period, a change in building materials became noticeable. A new type of brick was introduced with one flat surface and the other convex. Foundations were generally made of roughly surfaced limestone blocks. By the time of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, the temples in the major cities had already become comprehensive religious complexes. The Ekishnugal temple in the city of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nana, covered an area of approximately 400 by 200 meters, including not only the ziggurat, but also various sacred areas, shops, storage buildings, wide courtyards, and residences for temple personnel. The most striking structure of the complex was the ziggurat, a rectangular tower with a base measuring 60 by 45 meters and a height of 20 meters. The structure was built entirely of brick. Its exterior was first coated with mud plaster and then covered with baked bricks using bitumen mortar. The ziggurat was accessed by 3 separate staircases, each with about 100 steps. At the top stood a small sacred building, likely constructed with blue glazed bricks. The ziggurat was erected on a high terrace enclosed by double walls. On part of this terrace and around it stood a large temple also dedicated to the moon god Nana. The temple's spacious outer courtyard was surrounded by various storage and administrative offices. Nearby, there was another temple dedicated to Nana and his consort Ningal. Following these were the court building called Dublal and the Jiparku temple, dedicated to Ningal. The construction and renovation of every temple were carried out alongside countless rituals and religious ceremonies. An important example of this is found in a long poetic text discovered in Lagash and inscribed on the Gudea cylinders. Comprising 54 columns and approximately 1,400 lines, this impressive text was likely written by a poet in praise of the construction of the Eninu temple in Lagash on behalf of the god's faithful servant Gudea. Written in a highly ornate, elaborate, and scattered literary style, the poem depicts the rites and ceremonies accompanying the construction of the temple. Although imaginative elements heavily dominate the content, the sections summarized below offer significant insights. According to the poet, everything began after the destinies were decreed, and the city of Lagash was blessed by the fertile floodwaters of the Tigris. At this point, the city's patron god, Ningirsu, decided that Gudea should build a magnificent temple for him, namely Eninu. He conveyed this decision to Gudea through a dream. Although the events are narrated as if real, it is possible to interpret the dream as a fictional device crafted by the poet. The enormous figure that Gudea saw in his dream wore a divine crown, had wings like a lion-headed bird, and the lower part of his body was shaped like a flood wave. 2 lions sat beside him. This awe-inspiring figure ordered Gudea to build a temple, but Gudea could not fully comprehend the message. Then the scene changed. A woman appeared holding a golden stylus and examining a tablet bearing a celestial image decorated with stars. Next, a hero appeared carrying a lapis lazuli tablet on which the plan of a building was drawn. This figure was placing bricks into a brick mold in front of Gudea. At the same time, a specially trained male donkey was impatiently digging into the earth. Unable to fully grasp the meaning of the dream, Gudea decided to consult the goddess Nanshe, known for interpreting divine dreams. However, Nanshe resided in the Nina district of Lagash, and the most suitable route to reach it was by canal. Thus, Gudea boarded his boat and set out. Along the way, he stopped at many sacred sites to offer sacrifices and prayers to the gods there. Eventually, he reached the dock at Nina and entered the courtyard of Nanshe's temple with his head held high, presenting offerings, pouring libations, and praying. Then he recounted his dream to the goddess. Nanshe interpreted the dream as follows. The giant figure with a divine crown, lion-headed bird wings, and a flood-wave-shaped body was none other than Nanshe's brother, Ningirsu. The radiant figure shining like the rising sun on the horizon was Gudea's personal god, Ningish Zida. The woman holding the golden stylus and examining the star-decorated tablet was the writing goddess Nidaba, who guides you to construct the house in accordance with celestial order. The hero figure with the lapis lazuli tablet was the god Nindub, who drew the architectural plan of the temple. The brick mold and the fate brick within it represented the building blocks to be used in the construction of Eninu. The male donkey impatiently digging the earth clearly symbolized Gudea himself, eagerly prepared for this task. Nanshe then advised Gudea to build a new and ornamented war chariot for Ningirsu and to present it along with male donkeys, divine symbols, and weapons, accompanied by the sound of drums. After completing this task, Ningirsu sent another dream giving more detailed instructions, blessing Lagash with abundance and announcing that people from all over the world would unite to build Eninu with imported stones and timber. Upon waking, Gudea offered sacrifices and, seeing favorable signs, humbly set about fulfilling Ningirsu's command. He issued orders to his people, who responded with great enthusiasm and unity. First, he ensured moral and ethical purification in the city. There would be no complaints, punishment, or conflict. Mothers would not scold their children, and children would not defy their mothers. Slaves would not be punished for their mistakes, and slave girls would not be beaten for disrespect. All impure individuals were expelled from the city. After another series of omens and offerings, Gudea began to build Eninu valiantly. The poet narrates this process in a highly detailed, repetitive, and at times vague manner. The poem inscribed on the first cylinder ends with the completion of the temple complex. The literary narrative continues in the second cylinder. This part begins with Gudea's prayer to the Anuna gods and continues with his announcement to Ningirsu and his consort Bau that the temple is ready and suitable for occupation. Then, with the help of various gods, Gudea purifies the temple. He prepares food, offering drinks and incense for the grand ceremony welcoming the gods. He once again purifies the city morally. Next, he appoints the gods who would serve in the temple: a gatekeeper, steward, 2 weapon bearers, a messenger, chamberlain, charioteer, goat shepherd, 2 musicians, grain and fish inspectors, a bird keeper, and a herald. These appointments are depicted similarly to the godly assignments in the myth Enki and the world order. Finally, the sacred union of Ningirsu and Bau is celebrated. Then a great festival lasting 7 days is held. culminating in a banquet given in honor of the supreme gods An, Enlil, and Ninma. If we turn from the highly idealized description of the temple and cult to daily worship and rituals, it is natural to assume that regular offerings were made to the gods every day in the major temples of Sumerian cities. These daily offerings included presenting the god with animal and plant foods, water, wine, and beer. Burning incense was also a common practice. Of course, on holidays and special occasions, these ceremonies became far more magnificent and elaborate. From month names in the calendar, such as month of eating Ningirsu's barley, month of eating gazelle, or month of the festival of Shulgi, we understand that many religious festivals recurred throughout the year. Some of these festivals lasted for several days and were celebrated with special sacrifices and processions. Additionally, with the beginning of each new month, rituals were regularly performed on the 7th, 15th, and last days of the month. Among all these festivals, the most important was probably the New Year celebrations, which were observed with ceremonies lasting for days. The central ritual of the New Year was the Hieros Gamos, or sacred marriage rite. In this ceremony, a symbolic marriage believed to ensure the prosperity and abundance of the Sumerian people was performed. The king, as the representative of the monarchy, portrayed the god Dumuzi. The priestess represented the goddess of love and fertility, Inana. Although the origins of the rite are unclear, its development can be imagined as follows. At the beginning of the 3rd millennium BCE, Dumuzi was regarded as a revered ruler who had reigned in the city of Erech. In this city, the most respected deity was the goddess Inana. Throughout Sumer, Inana was accepted as a powerful goddess associated with fertility, love, and productivity. The names of Dumuzi and Inanna are closely intertwined with the myths and ceremonies from the early period of Erech. Over time, as Sumerian society moved toward a more centralized and national understanding, the pantheon was also reorganized accordingly. Within this theological framework, a new idea developed. Regardless of who the Sumerian king was or which city he came from, he had to become Inanna's consort to ensure the prosperity of the land and the welfare of the people. Once this concept became a dogma, the sacred marriage rite was formalized as a ritual. Every new year in Erech, this ceremony was performed between the king and a special priestess chosen from Inanna's temple and most likely ended in sexual union. In order to legitimize the rite, it had to be anchored in the past. Thus, Dumuzi's name was exalted in legends as Inanna's first husband and secured a permanent place in popular belief. We have little information about the clergy responsible for temple rituals. The administrative head of the temple was the Sangha, likely responsible for managing temple structures, financial organization, and the duties of personnel. The religious leader of the temple was the individual with the title En, who resided in a section called the Gipar. This position could be male or female, depending on the gender of the deity being worshipped. For example, in the Inanna temple of Erech, which was dedicated to Inanna, the En was male. Historical heroes such as Enmerkar and Gilgamesh were originally referred to by this title. In contrast, in the Ekishnugal temple of Ur, which served the moon god Nana, the En was generally a woman from the royal family, often the king's daughter. From the time of the Great Sargon onward, the names of these Ens were extensively recorded. Below the En, there were several classes of priests, such as Gudea, Ma, Ishib, and Nindingir. We have very little data about the duties of these classes. As far as we know, the Ishib was involved in sacred purification rituals and the sprinkling of liquids. The Gala was probably a kind of temple poet or singer. Additionally, Especially in temples dedicated to Inana, there were many eunuchs and temple concubines. Archaeological records reveal that temple staffs included not only religious figures, but also workers and slaves assigned to economic and administrative duties. The destruction of a Sumerian temple was considered one of the gravest disasters for the people and the city. One of the most poignant examples of this is found in the text, The Lament for the Destruction of Ur, written after the Elamites attacked Ur and captured Ibisin, the last king of the third dynasty of Ur. A section of this lament reads, "O Queen, how did you silence your heart? How did you endure death? O Ningal, lady of the ruined land, how could you live on? You are the woman of a shattered city. How can you go on? Your house has collapsed. It is filled with tears. The Gudea no longer walks with honor. The En no longer sits in the Gipar. There is no priest to perform purification rites, no Ishib to carry out Nana's sacred ceremonies. The festival house is silent. The joyful songs of the Ligi have ceased. There are no sacrificial animals. Oils are no longer offered. Milk no longer flows from the barns. The fishermen have vanished in misfortune. Even the bricks of the city cry out, 'Where are you, O God?'" This lament represents not only a physical destruction, but also a social, cultural, and religious collapse. Returning to Sumerian mythology, it must be noted that the myths we possess are not directly connected to ritual practices. Although ceremonies undoubtedly held a significant place in Sumerian religious practice, most myths are literary and explanatory in nature. These narratives are neither spoken worship texts nor explanations tied to specific rituals. Sumerian myths revolve around themes such as the creation of the universe, the birth of gods, love, hatred, curses, blessings, creation, and destruction. The theme of power struggles among the gods is quite rare, and when it occurs, such conflicts are never portrayed through resentment, violence, or bloodshed. Sumerian myths present a highly sophisticated and profound perspective on the gods and their divine activities. Behind these myths lies a serious cosmological and theological framework. However, the Sumerian myth writers were largely the inheritors of earlier poets and bards who lacked a written tradition. Their main goal was to produce poetic narratives about the gods that were impressive, inspiring, and also entertaining. Their primary tools were not reasoning and logic, but imagination and fantasy. In creating their stories, they did not hesitate to invent plot lines and motifs shaped by human behaviors and based on irrational foundations. Moreover, they readily incorporated legendary and folkloric elements widely known among the people into their narratives. To date, no explicit and detailed Sumerian myth has been found that directly addresses the creation of the universe. The limited number of cosmogonic ideas we know are derived from short and dense expressions scattered throughout various texts. On the other hand, we do possess many myths dealing with themes such as the ordering of the universe and cultural processes, the creation of humans, and the foundations of civilization. Although the number of gods emphasized in these narratives is small, their impact is substantial. The god of air Enlil, the god of water Enki, the mother goddess Ninhursag, also known as Nintu or Ninma, the god of the south wind Ninurta, the moon god Nana Sin, the god of nomadic peoples Martu, and especially Inana, frequently mentioned with her tragic fate as Dumuzi's consort. As previously mentioned, at the head of the Sumerian pantheon stands Enlil. Referred to as Father of the Gods, King of Heaven and Earth, and Ruler of all lands, Enlil is regarded in many myths as the organizer of the universe. For example, according to the narrative Enlil and the creation of the pickaxe, Enlil separated the sky from the earth, raised the essence of the land upward, invented the pickaxe and presented this tool to humans. The phrase black-headed ones used here likely refers to the Sumerians, or perhaps humanity in general. In another mythological debate, Summer and Winter, Enlil is portrayed as the creator of all trees and grains, the provider of abundance and sources of life. Here, the character Winter is shown as his direct appointee. So much so that even the other gods cannot act without Enlil's approval and blessing. One narrative recounts that after Enki built his sea house in Eridu, he traveled to the temple in Nippur to obtain Enlil's approval. Nana Sin, the moon god and protector of the city of Ur, also went to Nippur with a boat full of gifts to ensure the prosperity of his people, and thus earned Enlil's fertile blessing. However, although Enlil is the leader of the pantheon, he does not possess absolute power. In some Sumerian myths, his rather human traits are brought to the forefront. One of these tells of how Enlil was exiled to the underworld by the gods due to inappropriate behavior. In a time before the creation of humans, when only gods dwelled in Nippur, the young god Enlil became attracted to the young goddess Ninlil. Ninlil's mother, Nunbarshagunu, gave her daughter advice to initiate this relationship. "O my daughter, bathe in the clear water, walk along the riverbank so Enlil will see you. When the bright-eyed shepherd notices you, he will approach and kiss you." Ninlil joyfully follows her mother's advice, bathes in the pure river, and walks along the shore. Enlil sees her, desires her, and speaks of union. But Ninlil is hesitant, saying her body is too small and that she doesn't know how to kiss or join in union. Enlil then summons his vizier Nusku and asks him to bring a boat. He approaches Ninlil in the boat and takes her by force. As a result, Ninlil becomes pregnant with the moon god Sin. The gods are horrified by this act. Despite being the chief god, Enlil is captured and expelled from Nippur and exiled to the underworld. As Enlil strolled through Kiur, the 50 great gods, the 7 who determine fates, seized him and said, "You immoral Enlil, get out of the city." Thus, Enlil submits to divine decree and descends to the underworld. But the pregnant Ninlil does not leave him and follows him into the dark realm. This distresses Enlil, for the son she will bear, Sin, will have to remain in the land of the dead instead of rising to the light-filled sky. To resolve this, Enlil devises a plan. At each of the underworld's crossing points, the gatekeeper, the guardian of the river of the dead, and the ferryman, he disguises himself and unites with Ninlil. From these unions, 3 different gods are born and are made to remain in the underworld. Thus, Sin can ascend to the heavens and take his place as the god of light. This event offers insight into the gods' moral boundaries, the workings of divine order, and the notion of divine punishment, while also presenting the first example of divine disguise in mythology. One of the most detailed and information-rich narratives in Sumerian mythology is the myth of Enki, the god of water and wisdom, concerning the ordering of the universe. A complete and newly translated version of this myth appears in Chapter 5 of the work. Another myth about Enki tells a complex and not yet fully deciphered story about Dilmun, a paradise-like realm inhabited by the gods, which in some aspects can be compared to ancient Indian traditions. This myth focuses on the world of the gods rather than that of humans. To briefly summarize, Dilmun is portrayed as a pure, clean, and radiant land. Illness and death are unknown there. However, this paradise has a critical deficiency. It lacks fresh water, which is essential for life. In response, the water god Enki asks the sun, God Utu, to irrigate Dilmun with water drawn from the underworld. Once Utu fulfills this command, Dilmun becomes a garden created for the gods, adorned with fertile fields and lush pastures. In this sacred garden, the mother goddess Ninurta, probably originally conceived as an Earth Mother figure, cultivates 8 types of plants. However, these plants emerge only after 3 generations of goddesses impregnated by Enki give birth without any pain or labor. Later, Enki desires to taste the plants. He instructs his faithful servant, the two-faced god Isimud, to pluck these plants and bring them to him. Isimud picks them one by one and presents them to Enki, who eats all of them. This act enrages Ninurta, and she places a curse of death on Enki. To show that she will not return, she disappears from among the gods. Enki's health quickly deteriorates. 8 of his organs fall ill. As his condition worsens, the gods mourn deeply. Even Enlil, the god of air and leader of the divine assembly, cannot find a solution. At this point, a fox appears and claims it can bring back Ninurta, if appropriately rewarded. Although this part of the myth is damaged, it is understood that the fox succeeds. It brings back the mother goddess and ensures Enki's healing. Ninurta sits Enki beside her vulva, asks which 8 organs are in pain, and then creates 8 separate deities to heal each one. Thus, Enki recovers and returns to life. Although this myth focuses on the divine realm rather than humans, it bears remarkable similarities to the Garden of Eden story in the Bible. In fact, there are reasons to suggest that the concept of a paradise garden may trace back to the Sumerians. The Sumerian poem states that this paradise of the gods, Dilmun, was located east of Sumer. The Semitic Babylonians, who later conquered the Sumerians, placed their own land of the immortals, the land of the living, in this same region in Dilmun. The Bible states that Eden, where the garden was located, was east of the source of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This suggests that the 2 accounts may geographically overlap. The part of the poem where the sun god waters the land with the fresh water he draws from the ground resembles Genesis 2:6. But there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Additionally, the painless births by the goddesses may be a mythological counterpart to the curse of painful childbirth given to Eve. Enki's consumption of the 8 plants and subsequent curse also shares a similar narrative structure with Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge and then being cursed. But the most striking similarity relates to the biblical account of Eve being created from Adam's rib. Why, in that story, was the rib specifically chosen? If the biblical account is based on the Sumerian poem, the choice becomes easy to explain. In the Sumerian text, one of Enki's afflicted organs is the rib. The rib is called Tai in Sumerian. The goddess created to heal this organ is named Nintai, meaning Lady of the Rib. However, in Sumerian, Tai also means to make live or life. Thus, Ninti also means lady who gives life. In the Sumerian poem, these 2 meanings are fused in a wordplay. Although this kind of double meaning doesn't exist in Hebrew, if the biblical account was inspired by the Sumerian poem, it could be the origin of one of the Bible's earliest literary word plays. Another creation narrative in Sumerian mythology, involving Enki and Ninurta, pertains to the origin of humans. This story begins by describing the gods' predicament. They had to produce their own bread, particularly following the appearance of the goddesses. The gods voice their complaint, but Enki, known for his wisdom, remains deaf in deep sleep. Then their mother, Namu, the primeval sea, gathers their tears and offers them to Enki, saying, "O my son, wake up now. Show your wisdom. Create beings to serve the gods, beings in their likeness." Enki considers this, and taking the lead among the good and noble shapers, tells Namu, "Mother, the being whose name you gave has been created. Now place the image of the gods upon him. Mold his heart from clay drawn from the sea floor. Those who shape his body will firm up the clay. You will complete his limbs. Ninma will assist in this task. The birth goddesses will shape him with you. O mother, fix his destiny. Let Ninma place the model of the gods upon him. Now he is a human?" From this point, the poem does not only address the perfect human, but also the creation of individuals with various physical or mental flaws. It appears Enki holds a celebration for the gods, perhaps to honor the creation of humankind. During this feast, Enki and Ninma drink much wine and become overindulgent. Ninma shapes 6 flawed humans from the seafloor clay. Enki sets a destiny for each and gives them bread. Then Enki decides to create another being. The creative process is unclear, but the being that emerges is physically and spiritually extremely weak. Enki calls to Ninma to correct this failed creation. "I gave this being, shaped by your hands, its destiny and food. Now you too should fix what I shaped with my hand, determine its destiny, and give it sustenance." Though Ninma attempts to help, she fails. She speaks to the being with no response. She offers bread, but it cannot reach. It cannot sit, stand, or bend its knees. After a long dialogue between Enki and Ninma, Ninma curses the being, and Enki accepts that it was deserved. In another Sumerian tale, involving Ninurta, god of storm and the southern wind, Ninurta battles the monstrous demon Asag. Asag dwells in Kur, the land of the dead, and Ninurta initially fails to defeat him. Encouraged by his weapon Sharur's voice, he musters courage and ultimately slays Asag. However, Asag's death releases the primeval waters of Kur onto the earth, halting the Tigris's flow and starving the fields of fresh water. The fertility gods stand helpless. The waters will not rise, the fields will not be fed, the ditches will not be dug. The land yields no crops, only wild weeds grow. Ninurta responds by building a great dam of stones before Kur, containing the destructive flood. The waters are diverted back to the Tigris, fields are watered again, fertility returns, the crops prosper, and the gods rejoice. Ninma, the mother, is proud and sleepless, deciding to visit him. Ninurta, speaking lovingly, says, "O lady, because you dared to enter Kur and risk danger for me, let the lofty mound I have built be named Hursag, and let you be its queen." He blesses the mound Hursag, giving it plants, animals, precious metals. He curses the stones that sided with Asag and blesses those who aided him. Many Sumerian myths center on the love goddess Inana and the shepherd god Dumuzi. The stories of Dumuzi wooing Inana appear in 2 versions. In one, he competes with Enkidu. In another, he is accepted outright. However, these unions lead to a journey to the underworld that Dumuzi could not anticipate. One of the best preserved myths, Inanna's descent to the underworld, narrates how the Queen of Heaven, Inanna, enters the land of the dead with the aim of reigning there, and perhaps reviving the dead. Dressed and adorned according to divine laws, she prepares to step into the land of no return. Dumuzi, fearing for his sister wife, ultimately returns to the city. But there, underworld spirits called Gala capture him. They assault him with fist, foot, and whip, bind his hands and feet, and prepare to take him to the underworld. Dumuzi then pleads to the sun god, his father-in-law and brother-in-law, Utu. Utu, you are my brother by blood. I am your sister's husband. I brought food to Inana. I brought marriage gifts to Erech. Kissed her sacred lips, caressed her sacred thigh. Turn my hands to gazelle hands. Turn my feet to gazelle feet. Let me flee from the gala. Bring my spirit to Shubirila. Utu takes pity on Dumuzi's tears and transforms him into a gazelle to escape the gala and reach Shubirila. But salvation is short-lived. They pursue and capture him again, beating him. He prays again for transformation and to reach the wise old woman Belili's house, which Utu grants. He arrives and speaks. Wise woman, I am not just a mortal. I am the husband of a goddess. Let me drink of sacred hair water. Let me eat of the sacred grain. Before he can eat or drink, the Gala return, beat him again, and capture him a third time. Utu clothes him again as a gazelle. Dumuzi flees to his sister Geshtinana's sheepfold. But 5 Galas enter, capture him mercilessly, driving a nail into his cheek, then beating him with a shepherd's staff. The poem ends with this mournful scene. The first Gala enters the fold, drives a nail into Dumuzi's cheek. The second enters, strikes his cheek with a shepherd's staff. The third enters. The sacred pitcher is knocked off its peg. The fourth enters. The sacred water pot falls from its hook. The fifth enters. The pitcher is broken. No more milk flows. The water pot is broken. Dumuzi is no more. The sheepfold is left to the wind. Thus Dumuzi becomes both the beloved and victim of Inanna's love and wrath. But not all Inanna myths concern Dumuzi. In another narrative, Inanna cunningly obtains the cultural decrees, the Mi, from Enki. This myth is culturally and anthropologically significant. It lists more than 100 foundational features of civilization, including political, religious, social institutions, musical genres and instruments, and various intellectual and emotional behaviors. In brief, the plot goes as follows. The Queen of Heaven, Inanna, wishes to enhance her glory and the prosperity of Erech. She sets her sights on becoming the heart of Sumerian civilization. Thus, she travels to Dilmun, where Enki resides in the Abzu, to seize the sacred decrees, the Mi. Enki, apparently smitten, says to his messenger Isimud, "Listen, Isimud, a young girl approaches the Abzu alone. Invite her. Present her with buttered barley cakes. Pour cool water to soothe her heart. Let her drink beer before the lion. Greet her at the sacred feast, the feast of heaven." Isimud follows these orders to the letter. Inanna and Enki sit together at the feast. Enki becomes intoxicated and joyful, then bestows on her the Ma, over 100 divine decrees forming the foundation of civilization. Inanna joyfully receives them, loads them onto her heavenly boat, and heads back to Erech. When Enki sobers, he realizes the Mi are gone. He asks Isimud, who confesses giving them to Inanna. Enki repents and decides to prevent the boat from reaching Erech at any cost. He sends sea dragons to capture her vessel at 7 different stops. The dragons intercept the boat but allow Inanna to continue on foot. Isimud catches up with Inanna to relate Enki's decision. Inanna is enraged by Enki's betrayal. She sends her vizier Ninshubur, who successfully repels the sea dragons. Though Enki tries multiple times to reclaim the Mi, he fails. Inanna finally arrives in Erech by heavenly boat, where the people joyfully receive her. One by one, the divine decrees are unloaded. In another Inanna narrative, a mortal man named Shukalatuda plays a key role. A gardener who diligently tended his garden, his efforts were fruitless, as winds ravaged his crops. In desperation, he observes the heavens and divine messages, then plants a sarbatu tree of uncertain species that spreads shade from dawn to dusk. His garden revives and flourishes in shades of green. One day, the tired Inana descends to earth and lies down near Shukalatuda's garden to rest. Seizing the moment, the gardener forces himself on her. The following morning, Inana awakes to the violation and is furious, unable to let such dishonor stand, and determines to find the mortal at any cost. To undertake such restorations requires many published sources. This in turn means hundreds of tablets must be hand-copied, which is extremely laborious and time-consuming. To alleviate this situation even slightly, I have devoted most of the past 25 years to examining and copying unpublished Sumerian literary texts scattered across world museums. However, over time, it has become increasingly clear that this task cannot be accomplished by a single researcher alone. Fortunately, in recent years, many experts have joined in these efforts. Edmund Gordon's work on proverbs and fables, contributions from Muazzez İlmiye and Hatice Kızılyay from the archives of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, work by Ines Bernhardt in Germany, Eugen Bergman and George Castellino in Rome, and J.A. Van Dyck, working on the Baghdad and Leiden collections under de Liagre Boole and Adam Falkenstein. Most importantly, hundreds of Sumerian literary tablets were unearthed during the 1923 to 1934 excavations at Ur and are expected to be published soon. For this reason, there are strong grounds to believe that a significant portion of Sumerian literary texts will be made available to the academic world in the coming years. Yet, as experience, and many Sumerologists confirm, even when a Sumerian text is complete, translating and interpreting it remains quite difficult and sometimes arduous. Although Sumerian grammar is no longer as complex as it once was, developments in the field still largely rely on pioneering scholars like Delitzsch, Thoreau Dangjin, Zimmern, Landsberger, and especially Arno Pöbel. Thanks to the growing cooperation of experts in cuneiform worldwide, it will be possible in the next decade to obtain reliable translations of the core texts of Sumerian literature. In whatever form this unfolds, we are now in a position to provide a holistic view of Sumerian literature. In this context, the term Sumerian literature encompasses myths and heroic tales, hymns, laments, historical narratives, essays, codes of conduct, and proverbs. However, non-literary dedicatory inscriptions, reform declarations, or some political letters are excluded from this scope. The Sumerians probably began producing literary texts around 2500 BC. The oldest surviving examples date to around 2400 BC. For example, there is a roughly 20-column myth written on a hard clay cylinder from this period concerning Enlil and Ninurta, which also mentions other gods like Inana, Enki, and Ninurta. Although the plot is not fully understood, its motifs and structural features closely resemble those of later myths. This suggests an unbroken literary tradition spanning centuries in Sumerian culture. Supporting this idea is another myth from the 24th century BC about Enlil's son, the storm god Ishkur, disappearing into the underworld. In this tale, Enlil, deeply grieved, summons the other gods for aid, and a figure, possibly a fox, volunteers to rescue Ishkur. This reflects recurring motifs in narratives about descent from heaven to earth. There are many reasons to believe that Sumerian literary production increased over time, especially toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, as the Sumerian school, or Eduba, became an important educational institution. Production intensified further. Although spoken Sumerian gradually gave way to the Semitic Akkadian, Sumerian literature retained its influence well into the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. In the Eduba institutions active during and after the Esin dynasty, literary texts from earlier eras were eagerly read, copied, and edited. Nearly all of the literary texts we have today are known not directly, but through copies and adaptations produced in these later Edubas. In fact, teachers, poets, and scribes, likely speakers of Akkadian, working in these institutions may have composed new Sumerian literary works modeled on older templates, both in form and content. A common misconception holds that Sumerian literature was entirely religious in nature and composed by priests for temple rituals. But excluding hymns and laments, this view is unconvincing. For example, the idea that Sumerian proverbs, codes of conduct, or Eduba essays were written by priests or linked to temple rites is doubtful. Nor do we have solid evidence that epic narratives centered on heroes like Enmerkar, Lugalbanda, and Gilgamesh were written or read in temple contexts or composed by priests. Even for myths, especially in the Sumerian period and early post-Sumerian era, there is no evidence that these texts were used in temple ceremonies or religious festivals. Indeed, recent excavations at Nippur have revealed that tablets inscribed with hymns and laments were found not in temples, but in areas where scribes worked. This suggests that such texts were written by Eduba professionals, not priests. Likewise, we have no evidence that priests were part of the Eduba staff. The role of the Enear, or bard Chiot singer, is also significant in the emergence and development of Sumerian literature, alongside the Dubsar mentioned in hymns. Some individuals graduating from the Eduba likely specialized in religious texts, joined temple staffs, trained musicians and singers, and directed worship ceremonies. Others probably focused on myth and epic literature, entering the service of the palace, where they trained and led court singers and entertainment groups. But there is virtually no concrete evidence on these matters. Similarly, the intended audience or readers of these literary texts is unknown. Those who could read were mostly Eduba graduates, so it is unlikely that men of letters maintained private libraries for personal enjoyment or learning. Temples and palaces may have owned copies according to their needs, but true libraries likely existed only within the Eduba. Moreover, it would be insufficient to assume these texts remained on Eduba shelves solely for study. It is likely that they were publicly read or shared in temple, palace, or public gatherings. A very large portion of Sumerian literary texts was composed in poetic form. Although they lack an obvious meter or rhyme scheme, poetic devices such as repetition, parallelisms, similes, metaphors, choral sections, and refrains are used with remarkable creativity. The narrative style in myths and heroic tales typically features the constant repetition of certain epithets, formulaic phrases, elaborate descriptions, and lengthy dialogues. These tales rarely have tightly structured plots. The narrative is often loose, monotonous, and lax. Sumerian authors tended not to create climaxes or dramatic tension. Epic stories and myths do not increase in intensity or excitement as they progress. Their final scenes are generally no more striking than their beginnings. Additionally, there is no interest in character depth or psychological analysis. The gods and heroes in these narratives are presented not as vivid individuals, but as stylized, stereotypical figures. Among the poetic Sumerian narratives that have survived to modern times, one of the longest and best preserved is Enki and the World Order. Containing approximately 446 lines, 375 of these lines are fully or mostly intact. The most significant gaps occur at the beginning, the end, and between lines 146 and 181. The version presented here was reconstructed from 12 different tablets and fragments. The most important of these is a large 8-column tablet containing the full poem, which was discovered at Nippur, already split in two. One half went to the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania in the US, and the other half to the Hilprecht collection at Jena's Friedrich Schiller University in Germany. The second half remained unpublished until recently, and the complete text we now have results from the long-awaited reunion of these two parts. The poet begins the narrative with a hymn of praise to Enki. Although parts of this hymn are damaged and unreadable, it generally exalts Enki as the guardian of the cosmos and the provider of fertility to fields and flocks. This is followed by a self-praising song from Enki himself. In it, Enki's relations with the supreme gods, An, Enlil, and Nintu, and the lower gods, known as the Inuna, are recounted. Following a brief 5-line section in which the Inuna gods pay respects to Enki, Enki sings again, exalting his power to bring abundance and prosperity to the earth, describing the splendor of his sacred domain, Abzu, and recounting his joyous journey through the marshes in the boat, known as the Goat of Abzu. After this voyage, the lands of Magan, Dilmun, and Meluha send boats laden with offerings to present to Enlil. At the end of this section, the Inuna gods again pay homage to Enki, now specifically praising him as the guardian and steward of the Mi. Next, the poet describes various rituals and ceremonies performed by the spiritual leaders and priests in Enki's sacred Abzu domain. However, the second half of this section is heavily damaged. After another obscure break, Enki appears again in his boat, greeted by sea creatures who salute him and his rule of abundance. At this point, Enki is prepared to establish destinies. As expected, he begins with Sumer, praised as a high and sanctified land, the residence of gods. He then blesses its herds, sacred places, and temples. From there, he travels to Ur, exalting the city in exalted metaphors and bestowing wealth and nobility upon it. After departing Ur, Enki reaches Meluha, generously adorning it with trees, reeds, animals, birds, and metals like gold, tin, and bronze. He then addresses Dilmun's deficiencies. However, he harbors anger against enemies such as Elam and Marhashi, destroying their lands and seizing their riches. Meanwhile, he grants livestock to wandering Martu tribes as a form of mercy. Later, Enki undertakes tasks to ensure Sumer's fertility. First, he fills the Tigris River with sweet, life-giving water. In the poet's imagery, Enki is portrayed as a wild bull wedded to the Tigris, like a wild she-bull. To maintain the regular flow of the Tigris and Euphrates, he appoints the god Enbilulu as overseer of the canals. He enriches marshes and reed beds with fish and reeds, assigning them to a fish-loving goddess. He then turns to the seas, establishing his sanctuaries there and naming the sea goddess Nansha as overseer of these regions. He makes the rain fall, entrusting this duty to the storm god Ishkur. Returning to the land, he organizes plowing, yoking, and field work, appointing the farmer god Enkimdu to oversee it all. He plants grain and vegetables, assigning the grain goddess Ashnan to oversee them. He entrusts brick molding and digging to Kula, who begins construction and sets foundations, appointing Mushdama to supervise. He directs attention to the highlands, increases livestock, and places the mountain god Shumugan in charge. He builds stalls and pens, filling them with oil and milk, assigning the shepherd god Dumuzi to these tasks. He then defines the boundaries of cities and countries, setting up boundary stones and appointing the sun god Utu responsible for the cosmic order. Finally, he takes up the tasks of weaving and garment making and hands these to the goddess Utu, the deity of clothing craftsmanship. The myth takes an unexpected turn. The goddess Inana appears on stage, feeling that she has been excluded from power. Inana, Enlil's sister, complains that other goddesses such as Ninisina, Ninmug, Nidaba, and Nanshe have been granted various powers and privileges, but she has been overlooked. She brings her grievances before her father Enki. Inanna's lament is heard by Enki, who defends himself and reminds her that she too has been endowed with divine powers and gifts, symbols of shepherding, prophecy and war, weaving knowledge, the power of destruction and renewal. Enki further bestows upon her special blessings. At the poem's end, Enki's greatness is emphasized once again. The Anuna gods praise him. Enki spreads abundance across the earth. Plows work, waters flow, crops grow. By Enki's might, the land enters prosperity. He is the god who determines the destinies of the cosmos, and he blesses Sumer as the great mountain, the land of the cosmos. He then praises the holy city of Ur and decrees a prosperous fate for Meluha. He grants animals to the Martu. He punishes Elam and Marhasi, taking their spoils to Nippur to present to Enlil. Finally, Enki distributes all functions of nature and urban order among the gods, fixes the destinies, and gives order to the earth. Inanna's grievance highlights her importance. Though she initially feels excluded, Enki ultimately grants her divine me, elements of universal order, such as the art of weaving, prophecy, warfare capabilities, powers of renewal, and various symbols. Enki declares that these gifts belong to Inanna, and the myth concludes with the rebirth of Sumer and the world through Enki's organizing hand. Gilgamesh chooses to fight against King Aga of Kish rather than submit, but he cannot make this decision alone. He must first gain his people's approval. He stands before the elders' assembly of the city of Erech, calling for arms and freedom. The elders, however, prefer peace and submission, valuing the tranquility it brings, leaving Gilgamesh disappointed. He then addresses the assembly of the youth, again calling them to defend their city. This time they respond enthusiastically. The youth pledge to fight for heroism, freedom, and honor, and Gilgamesh joyfully accepts their support. He promises his loyal friend Enkidu that Aga will tremble before them. Within 5 days, 10 days, Aga besieges Erech. Fear grips the city. Gilgamesh calls for volunteers, and Birhurture steps forward, praising his king and offering to fight Aga. Yet Birhurture is captured at the city gate, beaten, and brought before Aga, who asks if he is Gilgamesh. Meanwhile, Zabardibunuga climbs the walls. Aga asks again if he is Gilgamesh. Birhurture denies it, but speaks in high praise. Aga continues the siege and torture. Gilgamesh himself then appears on the walls. The people are struck with awe and fear. Birhurture reveals the person on the walls is their king. Aga is deeply affected, halts the siege, and withdraws his army. Gilgamesh thanks Aga for his generosity, praising him as a noble leader who spared the fleeing and the fearful. The epic ends with a hymn of gratitude, celebrating Gilgamesh as Erech's savior. Aga's envoys depart Kish for Erech. Gilgamesh addresses the old men. "Let us dig all the city's wells and bind their ropes, but let us not bow to Kish. We will defend ourselves." The elders reply, "Let us dig the wells and bind the ropes, but let us bow to Kish. Do not point weapons at them." Gilgamesh is displeased and repeats his appeal to the youths. They respond with fervor. "You are our king, our hero. Erech is a god-blessed city. Our walls reach the sky. Our Inana temple stands on high and loves you. Why fear? Their army is small. They will tremble when they see you." These words embolden Gilgamesh. He addresses Enkidu. "The time for war has come. I will don weapons, spread fear and terror. When he sees me, fear will enter his heart." But Enkidu, fearful of death, expresses his concern. "Master, I saw him. That's why I'm afraid. You haven't seen him, so you aren't afraid. His teeth are like a dragon's, his face like a lion's, his roar like overflowing rivers. His brow is like a flood that swallows reeds. You go on, I will go back. I will tell your fame to your mother so she laughs, then recount your death so she cries." Yet Gilgamesh is resolute. "No one will die in my place. No raft will sink. Triple robes will not tear. No one will fall from the walls. Houses and huts will not be swallowed. If you help me, I will help you. What can happen to us? And then, after that, after the Magan boat sinks, after the power of Magalam fades, all the living will sit in the boat of the living. Let us advance together, eye fixed on him. If fear arises on the way, though you fear, even so, fight him." Enkidu replies, "As you wish, let us go. Come, let us press on." But hardly a quarter mile in, they arrive before the house of Huwawa. It stands beside a cedar, and Huwawa emerges, emitting a deathly gaze. He lifts his head like a guilty man and strides toward Gilgamesh, letting out a deafening roar. Gilgamesh's knees tremble, his legs freeze, but he does not retreat. Huwawa rises with massive claws, roaring and pawing. Voices cry out, "You are like a bull with a roaring mane, delight of the gods, valiant champion of battle, pride of your mother and nurse. Do not fear. Put your hand to the ground." But Gilgamesh doesn't touch the earth. He declares, "By my mother Ninsun and my father Lugalbanda's life, I know very well who you are. For you I made small sandals, and for you large sandals." He pulls up the first cedar tree by its root. His companions fell its branches, and they carry each to the mountain's foot. When they have cut the seventh tree, they draw near Huwawa's throne room. Gilgamesh pins the demon to a wall like a snake, slaps his cheek like a kiss, puts a nose ring on his neck, binds his arms like a war captive. Huwawa's teeth chatter. He grasps Gilgamesh's hand. "I have a word for Utu. I do not know my mother, nor my father. The ground gave birth to me, you raised me." He pleads for Gilgamesh's mercy on behalf of heaven, earth, and the underworld. He embraces Gilgamesh and kneels before him. Moved by compassion, Gilgamesh spares him and turns to Enkidu. But Enkidu responds, "Even the tallest may be swallowed by fate if he is foolish. If the bird returns to its nest, if the warrior returns to his mother, then you can never return to yours." Huwawa insults Enkidu. "You hired soldier, hungry, thirsty, begging. Why have you spoken ill behind my back?" Enkidu, enraged, draws his sword and cuts off Huwawa's head. They put it in a bag and bring it before Enlil. They open the bag and lay the head before him. Enlil sees it and becomes angry. "Why did you do this? You destroyed him and erased his name. May your faces be seared. May you burn in the sevenfold fire. May the water you drink be fire." Then Enlil introduces Gilgamesh to the seven Malam, and the poem ends with 3 lines whose meaning remains elusive. In the third section of the epic, Gilgamesh appears in different roles: a heroic knight, a commanding tyrant, a grieving friend, a wise counselor, a devoted lord, and finally a mortal seeking to understand the mystery of death. At his side is his loyal servant Enkidu, who is brave but pays a dear price for ignoring Gilgamesh's warnings. The story also features the Sumerian goddess of love, Inana, with her emotional turmoil and ominous gifts. The story begins with 2 brief introductions that are not directly related to the main subject, yet are very important for Sumerian creation mythology. The first section focuses on divine acts of creation, such as the separation of heaven from earth. In the second section, the struggle of the god of wisdom, Enki, with a dark force ruling the underworld is described. The forced abduction of Ereshkigal to the land of the dead echoes the myth of Persephone in Greek mythology. This narrative is interrupted because the poet is in a hurry to move on to the main topic. One day, a Hulupoo tree is planted on the banks of the Euphrates River. The south wind uproots the tree and sweeps it into the river's waters. At that time, the goddess Inana, wandering nearby, is filled with great fear because of the words of An and Enlil. She takes the tree and brings it to the city of Erech, to her sacred garden. She wants to make a throne and a chariot from the tree, so she watches over it carefully. Years pass, the tree grows, but it bears no fruit. For at its roots, a snake that knows nothing of magic has settled. In its crown, the dreadful Imdugud bird has built a nest, and on its trunk, the vampire woman Lilith has made her home. Joyful Inanna is now in tears. In the morning, the sun god Utu comes forth from the land of kings. Inanna tells him what has happened, but Utu does not help her. So Inanna goes to Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh responds to her call for help, dons his armor, takes up his axe, and destroys the dangers surrounding the tree. He kills the snake, the bird flies away to the mountains, and Lilith flees, destroying her home. Gilgamesh cuts down the tree, and with the help of the city's young men, separates its branches and presents it to Inanna to make a throne and a bed. From the tree's roots, Inanna makes a puku, and from its crown, a miku, and gives them as gifts to Gilgamesh. But Gilgamesh uses these gifts to call young men to war and bring sorrow to the city. Because of the tears of young women, the puku and miku fall into the great land beneath the earth, the land of the dead. Gilgamesh wants to retrieve them, but fails, and mourns at the gate of Ganzir. Enkidu, greatly saddened by this, decides to help Gilgamesh and offers to descend to the underworld. Gilgamesh warns him. He must not wear clean clothes, apply perfumes, or touch loved ones, because these actions draw upon him the sacred cries of the underworld. Enkidu does not heed these warnings and is captured in the land of the dead. He never returns to the surface. Gilgamesh is devastated and begs the god Enlil, but Enlil does not help. He then turns to Enki, the god of wisdom. Enki commands the sun god Utu to open a hole in the earth, allowing Enkidu's spirit to rise to the surface for a moment. Gilgamesh and the spirit of Enkidu meet and embrace, and Gilgamesh asks him what he saw in the underworld. The poem ends with this sorrowful question and answer section. Although the final parts are heavily damaged, the emotional and philosophical depth it contains is profound. It conveys the Sumerians' ancient reflections on life, death, and remembrance. In Sumer, hymn writing was a highly refined and aesthetically valuable form of art. Many hymns have survived, ranging in length from 50 to nearly 400 lines. However, many indications suggest that these examples reflect only a small portion of the hymn production in Sumerian history. These hymns are divided into 4 main categories in terms of content. The first is hymns of praise to the gods. In these hymns, either the poet directly addresses the god, or a god and his achievements are glorified in the third person. Notable examples include a hymn describing how civilization exists thanks to Enlil's grace, a hymn addressing the god Ninurta by different names, the famous Inana hymn attributed to Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon the Great. The second is hymns dedicated to kings. Among these, the most important are those dedicated to Shulgi, the second king of the 3rd dynasty of Ur. 5 hymns for this king can be almost completely reconstructed today. There are also 2 praise poems for Shulgi's father Ur-Nammu, and many hymns written for later kings, Idindagan, Ishmedagan, Lipit Ishtar. These texts often present the kings praising themselves in grandiose and exaggerated language. While this may appear excessively arrogant to us, it reflects the Sumerian cultural aspiration for prestige and superiority. The third is mixed hymns, written for gods and kings. This type blends the hymn tradition with elements of prayer and blessing. Interestingly, except for the chief goddess Ninurta, nearly all major gods of the pantheon, An, Enlil, Enki, Nana, Utu, Ninurta, Nergal, Inana, Bau, Ninisina, appear in this group. The prayers in these hymns are often directed toward kings of the third dynasty of Ur, or the early rulers of the first dynasty of Isin. For example, a text expressing King Eannatum of Lagash's devotion to the goddess Bau shows that the roots of this type go back to the pre-Sargonic period. The fourth is hymns dedicated to temples. These hymns glorify sacred structures. One of the best-known examples is written for Enlil's temple Ekur in Nippur. Another is dedicated to the temple of the goddess Ninhursag in Kesh. However, the most striking example is a work composed of short praise hymns dedicated to many important temples in Sumer and Akkad, containing over 400 lines. The most comprehensive and impressive among temple hymns is the one in the Gudea cylinder, a nearly 1,400-line text about the reconstruction of the Aninu temple in Lagash. As for the rules applied in writing Sumerian hymns, it is possible to see how sophisticated this art was. Hymns adhered not only to literary, but also to formal rules. This writing style, which became a highly refined genre, was divided into various subcategories by ancient poets and marked with special notes at the end of each text. The word used in Sumerian for hymn was sur. It is not certain whether this word is related to the Hebrew word shir, which also means song. When we look at the categories, some types of sur include sur hamun, probably hymns with harmonic structure; sur namnar, hymns with music; sur namgala, hymns performed by gala priests; sur namursaga, heroic hymns; sur namsipad inanaka, shepherd hymns dedicated to Inana, associated with the god Dumuzi. Some hymns were likely named according to the type of accompanying instrument. For example, tigi, possibly performed with a stringed instrument like a lyre; irshema, probably sung with drum accompaniment; adab, sung with a stringed instrument that has not yet been fully identified. In tigi and adab type hymns, the texts are divided into sections called sagara and sagida. These terms may mean tightened strings and long strings, respectively, and suggest that the hymns were sung with instrumental accompaniment. Additionally, adab laments include sections like barsud and shabatuku, whose meanings are still unclear. These hymns usually end with a 3-line prayer called urunbim. Both adab and tigi hymns contain responsorial reading sections similar to a chorus refrain, consisting of 1 to 4 lines. These parts are usually marked as izkig, though the exact meaning of this notation is still. There are also hymns divided into stanzas called kirigu, which is thought to mean kneeling. These stanzas are usually followed by a refrain section also called izkig. In Sumer, there were fundamentally 2 types of laments. The first was written because of the destruction of cities or city-states. The second was about the death of the god Dumuzi or other gods. The best preserved examples of the first type are 2 laments written for the destruction of Ur. Another one concerns the destruction of Nippur. This text ends with the city's reconstruction by the Isin king Ishmedagan and concludes in an atmosphere of joy. Laments written for Dumuzi vary in length from poems exceeding 200 lines to short elegies of fewer than 50 lines. Although the majority of these texts have been published, especially those written in phonetic script, still lack reliable translations. The final group of Sumerian literary texts we will discuss consists of the wisdom literature, which includes various disputation texts, short and long essays, moral advice, and proverbs. Among Sumerian writers, the disputation genre was quite popular and represents an early form and forerunner of the debate genre that became widespread in Europe during late antiquity and the Middle Ages. In this type of text, two symbolic characters, usually animals, plants, metals, professions, seasons, or man-made tools that possess opposing qualities, are placed in opposition. In the verbal duel between these two sides, each in turn praises itself, tries to prove its superiority, and uses expressions to belittle the other. However, all of these debates are written in a poetic style. This is because Sumerian writers were direct inheritors of the oral tradition poets of much earlier times, and for them, poetry was a much more natural form of expression than prose. Disputation texts usually begin with a mythological introduction in which the creation of the two contenders is described. After this, a long section of debate follows, and in the end, a divine judgment determines the winner. The text concludes with this verdict. Today we have 7 such disputation texts: the dispute between winter and summer, the dispute between cattle and grain, the dispute between bird and fish, the dispute between tree and reed, the dispute between silver and strong copper, the dispute between axe and plow, the dispute between millstone and gulgul stone. Except for the last one, these texts are generally between 200 and 300 lines in length. The longest and best preserved ones are the dispute between winter and summer, and the dispute between cattle and grain. Let us examine the dispute between winter and summer. This text begins with the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, Enlil, deciding to create all kinds of trees and grains and bring abundance to the land. For this purpose, Enlil creates 2 semi-divine brothers, Emesh, also called summer, and Enten, also called winter, and assigns each of them unique duties. Here are the tasks performed by Emesh. He causes female sheep to give birth to lambs and goats to kids. He increases the number of cows and calves. He boosts the production of cream and milk. He ensures that wild goats, sheep, and donkeys in the plains live joyfully. He makes birds of the sky build nests. He increases the fish of the sea and the eggs in the reeds. He increases honey and wine in the date groves and vineyards. He makes the trees bear fruit and fills gardens with greenery. He increases grain in the fields. He makes it flourish like the grain goddess Ashnan. He enlarges stables and sheepfolds and enhances the productivity of farms. He fills the granaries and brings abundant crops to homes. He has cities and houses built, and he establishes temples. After completing their tasks, the 2 brothers wish to go to the House of Life in Nippur, where their father Enlil resides, to offer gifts of gratitude. While Emesh brings animals, birds, and plants, Enten selects stones, metals, trees, and fish. But at the gate of the temple, Enten, consumed by jealousy, attacks his brother Emesh, and a fierce debate ensues between them. As the debate deepens, Emesh objects to Enten calling himself the farmer of the gods. Eventually, they both reach Enlil's great temple Ekur, where they each present their arguments. Enten addresses Enlil as follows: "Father Enlil, You gave me responsibility for the canals. I carried abundant water. I multiplied the fields and filled the granaries. I increased grain and made it flourish like Ashnan. But now Emesh, who knows nothing of agriculture, pushes my shoulder and shakes my arm. He tries to humiliate me in the palace. Clever Emesh begins to speak with flattering words to win Enlil's favor. But what he says about the quarrel is short and not fully understood. Then Enlil responds to both brothers, Emesh and Enton. The life-giving waters for all lands are under Enton's charge. He is the farmer of the gods. He produces everything. Emesh, my son, how can you consider yourself equal to your brother Enton? With Enlil's deeply meaningful and exalted words, the decision becomes clear. The gods' verdict is final. Who can oppose it? After this decision, Emesh kneels before Enton and prays to him. He offers him nectar, wine, and beer in his home. They both drink these drinks in joy, their hearts filled with happiness. Emesh gives Enton gifts of gold, silver, and lapis lazuli. They drink together in brotherhood and friendship. In this dispute, Enton, the faithful farmer of the gods, emerges victorious. O Father Enlil, thanks be to you. Now let us examine the dispute between cattle and grain. This debate features two main characters, Lahar, the cattle god, and his sister, Ashnan, the grain goddess. According to the myth, these two deities were created to provide food and clothing for the Inana gods, the children of the sky god An. However, until humans were created, the Inana gods could not fully benefit from the blessings offered by these two deities. In the introduction of the text, this situation is described as follows. After the separation of heaven and earth, and brought forth the Inana gods. But Ashnan, the grain goddess, had not yet been born, had not yet been created. Utu, the goddess of clothing, had not yet been created, and no sacred place, Temenos, had been built for her. Sheep and goats had not yet given birth. The female sheep did not give 2, nor the goat 3 offspring, because the great gods had not yet defined the names of Ashnan and Lahar. 30- and 40-day grains did not yet exist. Mountain grains, small cereals, and the pure seed of life had not yet been created. Utu had not yet been born. Therefore, the crowns of plants had not yet appeared. The god of the plains, Sumugan, was also not yet present. In that time, when mankind had not yet been created, the gods did not know how to eat bread or wear clothes. They fed on grass like sheep and drank from ditches. During that time, in the Duku houses, the creative domain of the gods, Lahar and Ashnan, are created. But their products are not enough for the Inana gods. Neither milk nor grain satisfies them. Then, the creation of humans is decided. From Lahar's sheepfolds came the best milk, but it flowed for the insatiable gods. Therefore, mankind was created. Breath was given to serve the sheepfolds and the blessings. The continuation of the text describes how Lahar and Ashnan are brought down from the heavens and the contributions they made to humanity. On that day, Enki addresses Enlil. Father Enlil, let us bring Lahar and Ashnan, these two sacred ones created in Duku, down to earth. By the divine command of Enki and Enlil, Lahar and Ashnan are brought down from the heavens. A sheepfold is established for Lahar. Abundant grass and plants are provided. A house is built for Ashnan. A plow and yoke are given to her. Lahar lives like a shepherd who increases abundance in the sheepfolds. Ashnan is a generous and sincere virgin who stands amidst the fields. These two sacred beings bring the blessings from the heavens to the earth. They bring abundance to the people. They breathe life into the land. They arrange the shares of the gods. They fill the granaries and storehouses. They bring abundance to the homes of the poor. They carry prosperity to every place they step on. But over time, Lahar and Ashnan drink so much wine that they begin to fight. They fall into a quarrel in the farms and fields. Each one praises their own contributions while belittling the other. At the end of this long debate, Enlil and Enki intervene and declare that the victor is Ashnan. In Sumerian literature, 4 disputation texts of this kind are directly related to the Sumerian school, its students and graduates. 2 of these, the dispute between Enkimancy and Gimishag, and the dispute between a Ugula and a scribe, have been discussed in more detail in sections related to education. In addition, the dispute between Enkita and Enki-Hegel and the dispute between 2 school graduates are also included in this category. The dispute between Enkita and Enki-Hegel consists of about 250 lines and begins with a rather surprising statement. "Friends, today we are not working." Following this unusual introduction, the dispute begins, composed of about 20 paragraphs. Most of these paragraphs are 4 to 5 lines long and are filled with sarcastic and demeaning remarks each character directs at the other. For example, one character says, "Where is he? Where is that man who compares himself with my lineage? Neither woman nor man can compare his ancestry to mine. Neither among masters nor among slaves is your lineage like mine." The other replies in turn, "Hold on now, don't boast too much. You have no future." These words further escalate the tension, as the response quickly follows. "What do you mean I have no future? My future is in no way inferior to yours. In both wealth and lineage, I am your equal." In another example, one character belittles the other by accusing him of lacking musical knowledge. "You have a harp, but you don't understand music. Your friends call you a water child. You cannot produce a single note. You stutter when speaking. You cannot properly speak Sumerian. You can't even sing a hymn. You can't open your mouth. Come on, tell me, are you really a skilled man?" The dispute becomes increasingly harsh with mutual insults. When one side insults the other's family, it is decided that a resolution is necessary. It is proposed that they return to their cities and let their friends judge. However, the text here is quite complex and unclear. As far as can be understood, the pair is sent to the Ugula, a kind of overseer, in the Eduba, the school's administration. This person declares that both are at fault and ends the dispute by scolding them for wasting their time arguing. The dispute between 2 school graduates is about 140 lines long. The text begins with one disputant saying, "Old graduate, come and argue with me." In response to this bold opening, the rival replies in a similar tone, and a string of derogatory remarks continues throughout the dispute. The text ends with one party delivering a 28-line, sharp and sarcastic insult directed at his opponent. Another example of this genre is a dispute between 2 unnamed women. It is written in the Emissal dialect of Sumerian, a dialect particularly used for female characters in Sumerian literary texts. This text, with over 250 lines divided into 25 paragraphs, is filled with biting, sarcastic, and sometimes obscene language that rivals the dispute between 2 school graduates. By contrast, the essay genre seems to have attracted much less interest in Sumerian literature. At present, we possess only a small number of texts that can be categorized as essays. 2 of these have a Job-like character, dealing with human suffering and submission to fate. Both are examined in Chapter 6. One of these poetic documents is written partly in dialogue form and addresses school life and the value of education. The other is found on a tablet in the Hilprecht collection in Jena. This short essay describes a man named Tani, who is violent, hates truth and justice, behaves as he pleases in the assembly, and arouses hatred among those around him. Aside from these, there may also be short or miniature essays written on various subjects. However, the information available to us is not sufficient to determine the true nature of these texts. In Sumerian literature, there are three important compilations that contain rules of behavior and advice: the Farmer's Almanac, the Instructions of Shuruppak to his son, Ziusudra. A third text with moral and ethical themes. Among these, the Instructions of Shuruppak to his son, Ziusudra is particularly notable as an example of the tradition of basing wisdom texts on wise kings of the past. This style is reminiscent of the Book of Proverbs in the Bible. Although this text was written around 2000 BC, its content is attributed to King Shuruppak. Shuruppak was the father of Ziusudra, the hero of the flood, and Ziusudra is presented here as the ideal type of the wise king. The text's biblical-like language is evident in its very first lines. Shuruppak gave advice to his son, Shuruppak, son of Ubartutu, spoke to his son, Ziusudra. "My son, I will give you advice. Listen to my words. Give ear to what I say to you. Do not disregard my counsel. Do not violate my words. Diligently follow your father's precious advice." As for proverbs, another type of wisdom literature, the collection of Sumerian proverbs we possess consists largely of about 700 tablets and tablet fragments. Most of these had not been identified until 1953. Most of the tablets contain either complete collections of proverbs or selected sections from them. Others are exercise tablets used in schools. These tablets usually contain a single proverb or very short excerpts. Researcher Edmund Gordon examined all the Sumerian proverbs in detail and reached the conclusion that the ancient Sumerian scribes prepared at least 15 to 20 different standardized collections of proverbs. 12 of these can now be largely reconstructed and together contain more than 1,000 proverbs. About half of the collections organize the proverbs by their first syllables. In the others, grouping is based on key words. Although some proverbs are close in meaning, the logic of the grouping is not always clear. Nonetheless, Sumerian proverbs reflect with sharp wisdom, not always gently, the motives, contradictions, hopes, and desires of human life. Here are some examples of these sayings. "Leave what is mine untouched. Let me use what is yours." This proverb reflects the feeling of being unwelcome in a host's home. "You don't tell me what you've earned, only what you've lost." "Wealth is like a flock of sparrows. It can hardly find a place to land." "Don't pick it today, it will bear fruit tomorrow." "He who eats too much cannot sleep." Lastly, we must mention the systematic catalogs in which hundreds of Sumerian literary works were recorded, preserved, and stored. So far, 7 catalogs dating to the 2nd millennium BCE have come to light. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the Louvre Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology, the Berlin Museum, the Hilprecht Collection at Friedrich Schiller University, a provisional catalog at the British Museum. These 7 catalogs contain the titles of more than 200 Sumerian works, texts that can be considered books. The titles usually consist of the first part of the text's first line. 2 of the catalogs are dedicated solely to hymns. The remaining 5 include titles from various genres. The methods used in preparing these catalogs are not always clear. One would expect classification by content, but this is evident only in certain examples. Especially in the catalog from the Iraq Museum, it is noted that the texts were kept in special boxes, which may have also been the case for the other catalogs. Recently, an 8th literary catalog, quite different from the existing 7, was discovered. This catalog was identified and partially translated by the editors of the Assyrian Dictionary Project, published by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago. This text holds particular importance because, based on its writing style, it is understood to originate from a very early period, possibly the 3rd dynasty of Ur. However, very few literary texts from this period have survived to the present day. Yet, interpreting this new catalog text is quite difficult, as it resembles none of the examples known from later periods. The preliminary translation below, prepared with the great contribution of my former assistant Miguel Civil, should be considered merely a preliminary and preparatory evaluation of this text. In this new catalog, a sequence is observed starting from the first tablet of the work titled Enki went up to the dining hall, and extending to the tablet that begins with the words, the highest point of the sky. Some of the lines included in this section are as follows. He who knows the eclipse of the moon and sun, whose mother knows the songs, the reed that nods, gods of war, the enemy, the warrior twins. All these tablets form the successive parts of the work. Enki went up to the dining hall, and all were found within a pit. However, none of the tablets from this early period provide direct information about the structure, operation, or organization of the school system. To access such details, one must turn to sources from the first half of the 2nd millennium BC. Indeed, excavations from this period have yielded hundreds of practical exercise tablets written by students as part of their daily assignments. These tablets range from examples clumsily written by first-year students to quite neat and aesthetic writings by students nearing graduation. Thanks to these tablets, important inferences can be made about the educational curriculum and teaching methods of the period. Moreover, it is seen that teachers themselves also wrote texts about school life, and some portions of these writings have survived to this day. When all this information is gathered, a highly detailed and historically unique picture of the goals, students, teaching staff, curriculum, and teaching techniques of the Sumerian school can be obtained. Sumerian schools were called Eduba, meaning tablet house. The main purpose of these institutions was to provide practical vocational training. That is, they were essentially established to train scribes to meet the economic and administrative needs of the country, especially for temples and palaces. They continued this function throughout their existence. However, over time, with the expansion of the curriculum, the Eduba became not just a vocational school, but also a center of culture and knowledge. In these institutions, subjects such as theology, botany, zoology, geography, mathematics, grammar, and linguistics were taught, the prevailing knowledge of the period, and in some areas, scientific contributions were also made. Unlike modern educational institutions, Sumerian schools were also the center of creative writing. Ancient texts were copied here, and new ones were written here. Therefore, although most graduates served in the palace, temple, or the households of the elite, some dedicated their lives to teaching and learning. Just like today's university professors, these Sumerian academics lived on salaries and devoted their spare time to research and writing. Originally established as institutions attached to the temple, these schools eventually became secular and independent institutions. It is understood that teachers supported themselves with tuition fees paid by students. Also, the curriculum largely carried a secular character. Undoubtedly, education was neither widespread nor compulsory. The vast majority of students came from wealthy families. Poor children did not have the time or financial resources required for a long-term education. This assumption had previously been accepted on logical grounds. However, about 10 years ago, the Luxembourgish cuneiform expert Nicolas Schneider clearly proved this situation based on written documents from the period. in thousands of texts related to economy and administration dating to around 2000 BC, about 500 individuals identify themselves as scribes, and some also introduce themselves in more detail by including their fathers' names and professions. In his analysis of these data, Schneider determined that the fathers of scribes, that is, school graduates, were usually people of status such as governors, city administrators, envoys, temple officials, officers, captains, high-ranking tax collectors, priests, enterprise managers, inspectors, foremen, scribes, archivists, or treasurers. Only one woman is mentioned by name as a scribe in these lists. This strongly suggests that Sumerian schools were most likely open only to male students. At the head of the Sumerian school stood the school father, or in other words, the Umiya. This title meant expert or professor. Students were called school sons, and graduates were referred to as school sons of former days. Teaching assistants were referred to as older brothers, and their duties included preparing tablets for students to write on, reviewing written tablets, and listening to memorized lessons. In addition to these, the school also had staff such as a person responsible for drawings, a person responsible for Sumerian, supervisors monitoring attendance, and officials in charge of discipline. However, we have no definitive knowledge about the hierarchical order among these teaching personnel apart from the school father. Regarding the curriculum of Sumerian schools, we have very detailed and direct information. This allows us to base our understanding of Sumerian education not merely on interpretations or scattered clues, but on written materials prepared by the students themselves. When comparing the simple exercises of beginner students with advanced copies that approach the level of a teacher, it becomes clear that the Sumerian education system was divided into two main sections: semi-scientific and instructional content, literary and creative works. The semi-scientific content did not arise from a modern sense of scientific curiosity, but from the need to teach language directly. Developed to teach scribes how to write in Sumerian, this system was based on memorizing words and phrases that were grouped thematically. This pedagogical method, born of necessity, eventually became standard across all Sumerian schools. The prepared lists included various natural elements such as trees and reed types, animals, countries, cities, stones, and metals. These lists show that Sumerian students gained a considerable familiarity with natural sciences such as botany, zoology, mineralogy, and geography. The significance of this situation for the history of modern science has only recently been recognized. Sumerian teachers also prepared numerous mathematical tables and solved problems. In the field of linguistics, highly advanced studies were conducted. For example, long grammar lists were compiled on noun constructions and verb conjugations. These documents show how well the Sumerians understood grammar. Toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, when Sumerian cities began to be conquered by Semitic Akkadians, Sumerian ceased to be used as a spoken language. However, the great interest in Sumerian literature continued. This led to the creation of the first dictionaries, in which Sumerian words and phrases were paired with their Akkadian equivalents, making them the oldest known dictionaries in human history. The second, creative part of the curriculum was largely based on studying, copying, and imitating literary works. Most of these texts were written in poetic form and ranged in length from 50 to 1,000 lines. Among the literary texts discovered so far are mythological poems dealing with gods and heroes, hymns written for gods and kings, laments for the destruction of Sumerian cities, proverbs, fables, essays, and wisdom texts. It has been established that most of the approximately 5,000 literary tablets recovered were written as exercises by students of that time. Although our knowledge of the teaching methods used in Sumerian schools remains limited, some fundamental practices can be understood. When a student arrived at school in the morning, they would first review the tablet they had worked on the previous day. Then, the older brother would prepare a new tablet, and the student would continue working by copying it. Memorization played a significant role in the teaching process. Teachers and assistants probably supplemented the texts and lists copied by students with oral explanations. Unfortunately, these oral lessons were never written down and are now completely lost. Although the teaching approach used in Sumerian schools does not align with modern concepts of progressive education, it did possess a certain pedagogical structure. Students began with very simple syllable exercises. After this initial step, students would learn lists covering around 900 basic signs, along with their pronunciations. In the next phase, they would memorize hundreds of words composed of 2 or 3 signs. Afterward, they would move on to more extensive lists containing thousands of words and expressions organized by meaning. The sections of the curriculum that could be called natural sciences included topics such as parts of the human and animal body, domesticated and wild animals, birds, fish, trees, plants, stones, and celestial bodies. The lists of objects were particularly detailed. For example, wooden items, more than 1,500 objects ranging from raw wood pieces to boats and chariots. Items made from reed, leather, hide, and metals, ceramic vessels, garments, food, and drinks. There was also a special category for place names, lists of countries, cities, villages, rivers, canals, and agricultural lands. Additionally, special lists of around 800 words included common expressions used in administrative and legal documents, names of professions, kinship terms, and physical disabilities. Once the student had mastered the complex word structure of Sumerian, they would begin copying short sentences, proverbs, and animal tales. At the same time, compilations of model contracts that formed the basis of legal documents, which played a major role in economic life, would be memorized. In addition to language education, mathematics lessons were also provided to students. These lessons included instruction in units of measurement such as volume, length, and weight. Multiplication tables and conversion charts between different units were used. In later stages, students solved practical problems related to wage calculation, canal excavation, and construction work. Discipline, meanwhile, was an important matter in the school. Using the stick to train students was quite common. Teachers not only encouraged their students with praise, but also frequently resorted to the rod to correct their mistakes. Therefore, the life of a Sumerian student was by no means easy. They were required to stay at school from sunrise to sunset. Although it is assumed that there were some holiday days during the year, we have no definite information on this. Students typically began their education as children and continued until they became young adults. Although the question of when and in which area students specialized is interesting, our knowledge on this topic is insufficient. Some observations can also be made about school buildings. In various excavations across Mesopotamia, buildings possibly used as schools have been uncovered. One of these is in Nippur, another in Sippar, and another in the city of Ur. However, aside from the presence of many tablets, these structures do not feature any architectural distinction unique to schools. Therefore, it is not certain whether these buildings were indeed schools. In contrast, about 15 years ago, during excavations by French archaeologists in the city of Mari, 2 rooms were discovered that were clearly identified as classrooms, made of baked brick and equipped with benches for 1, 2, or 4 people. There may be a possible reference to the structure of a school building in a Sumerian riddle. The riddle goes, "A house whose plow is like the sky, covered like a copper jug. It walks on the ground like a goose. One enters it with closed eyes. One exits with eyes opened." Answer: school. This riddle was copied from a tablet found in Ur by Cyril J. Gadd, who worked at the British Museum. Although the first part of the riddle is difficult to understand, the final two lines clearly express the fundamental purpose of the school: to transform the illiterate into someone knowledgeable. As previously mentioned, we have many texts written by ancient teachers to educate their students. These compositions vividly and in detail reflect the relationships between teacher and student, parent and student, and graduate and student. 4 important examples, named according to their content, are school days, the school bully, the dispute between Enkimansi and Gurnashag, the scribe and his wayward son, a conversation between a Ugala and a scribe. Among these texts, the writing titled School Days stands out in particular. This text narrates what school life was like from the mouth of a former student, with nostalgic and humanizing detail. Written around 2000 BCE, it is one of the most touching documents obtained from excavations in the ancient Near East. The expressions in the text clearly show that human nature has not changed much in thousands of years. For instance, the student of that time, just like today's student, tries not to be late out of fear of being beaten by the teacher, asks his mother to prepare lunch when he wakes up in the morning, and gets beaten by both the teacher and the assistant if he misbehaves at school. The translation of the expression "to get beaten" is quite clear. In Sumerian, this phrase consists of the signs for stick and flesh. As for the teachers, it appears they too had difficulty making ends meet. Receiving extra contributions from the student's family would please them greatly. This resembles a humorous ancient reference to the low salaries of teachers today.